Delighted to be with you. I've got a colleague here, Michael Horn, who has a deep background in education and then was foolish enough to come to Harvard Business School to get an MBA and was in my class, and I suckered him into taking a vow of poverty to stay with me and help me think through these things and try to write a book about it that is called Disrupting Class. I know very little about education, but I have spent my academic life studying the problems of innovation. And whereas a lot of research on reforming and improving our schools is organized around let's study education to reach conclusions about education, what I've tried to do is say, no, I've just been studying innovation in the context of government and not-for-profits and for-profits. And so let me stand on the outside of the education industry and examine these problems and opportunities through the lenses of my general research. And so what I'd like to do is, in the first half of my time with you, talk about several of the lenses from our research that seem to be salient to the problems of innovation in education, and then in the last half try to apply those. And I'm sorry I just have to stand here rather than walk around and make it more interesting like we do at our school when we teach by the case method. But the first model that we decided was really quite salient, and especially to you, arose from a line of study that I've been involved in now for about 15 years. And that study is around the question, what is it that causes successful companies to fail? And it's a puzzle because if you look across the sweep of business history, most companies, which at one point were regarded as wildly successful, and they were broadly admired, a decade or two later you find them in the middle of the pack and the bottom of the heap. And this model was really quite helpful in understanding why successful companies so frequently can't sustain that. So I'll plot on the vertical axis the performance of a service or a product over time on the horizontal axis. And there are two elements of this model. The first is that in every market there's a trajectory of improvement that customers can use. Now there's a distribution of customers in each market. So at the high end there are very demanding, complicated problems where the people there will never be satisfied with the best you can give them. And at the bottom of every market, there are simple problems and people who can be overserved by very little. So that's the first piece of the model, is that there is a trajectory of improvement that people can utilize. The second is that in every market, there's a different trajectory of improvement that innovating companies provide as they keep introducing better and better products. The most important finding about this is this trajectory of technological progress almost always outstrips the ability of customers to use the progress. And a great way to visualize that is if you go on the left-hand side, in the mid-1980s when we were first learning how to do word processing on those early personal computers, do you remember how often you had to stop your fingers to let the Intel 286 chip catch up? Because it wasn't even fast enough to keep pace with your fingers. But as Intel kept introducing faster and faster chips, when they got to the right-hand side with the 3 gigahertz Pentium 4, they had shot way beyond the speed that most customers in mainstream business applications could use. And at the same time, at the very demanding end of the market, there still are a few freaky nerds and hardcore gamers that want even faster chips, but they've overshot what most people can use. Now, some of the innovations that help companies move up that trajectory are just simple year-to-year incremental improvements, whereas others are dramatic breakthrough, leapfrogs beyond this current state of the art. What we found in our study is that almost always these two types of innovations aren't salient to the outcome, because both their purposes, the incremental improvements, the breakthrough improvements, are to sustain that trajectory of improvement as it existed in the market. And what we found is that almost invariably the companies that are the leaders in the industry on the left-hand side, before these innovations begin, or these battles of sustaining innovation begin, find themselves still leading the industry on the right-hand side when those battles are over. And it really doesn't matter technologically how radical or difficult the innovation is. It just seems like if the purpose of the innovation is to help the leaders in an industry make better products that they could sell for better profits to their best customers, they figure out how to get it done. In other words, when a sustaining innovation is at question, and I want to bet who's going to win, I will always bet on the leading companies in the industry. But it turned out that there was another kind of innovation that we called a disruptive innovation that always killed the leaders. And we used this word disruptive not because it was a breakthrough improvement, but instead of sustaining that trajectory, it disrupted it by bringing to the market a product that actually wasn't as good as the ones that the leaders were selling up there on the blue trajectory. But it was simple and convenient and affordable. And it could take root in an undemanding application at the bottom of the market and then improve to intersect with the mainstream needs later. And it turned out that almost invariably an entrant company came in and killed the leader when one of these disruptions emerged. So the odds of success are really very different. Now, what I'd like to do is walk through a little case study that was really quite important or quite useful to me in understanding why the odds of success on the sustaining versus the disruptive trajectories are so different. And I think you can see that where we're leading is that computer-based learning is a disruptive innovation relative to the traditional methods of delivering education. Where the puzzle came from was just living here in the Boston area, watching that very successful computer company Digital Equipment Corporation collapse in the early 1990s. And those of you who remember Digital would remember that through the 70s and most of the 80s, it was probably the most widely admired company in the world economy. And whenever you read explanations in the business press about why Digital Equipment was so successful, it was always attributed to the brilliance of the management team. Then about 1988, the company just fell off the cliff and began to unravel very quickly. When you then read explanations about why they had stumbled so badly, it was always attributed to the ineptitude of the management team. Those are the very same folks running the company. For a while, I framed the question as, gosh, I wonder how smart managers could get that stupid that fast. And that really is the explanation that most people adopt when they see a previously successful company stumble. It's somehow a management team that had its act together at one point was out of its league at another. But the reason the stupid management hypothesis just didn't feel right is that every mini-computer company in the world collapsed in unison. It wasn't just Digital, but Data General, Prime, Wang, Nixdorf, Hewlett-Packard. And you'd expect them occasionally to collude in setting prices, but to collude to collapse was a stretch. And there just had to be something more fundamental went on. And so let me just use this model then to explain, or to give you its explanation of why that company failed. Now, Digital made a class of computers that were called mini-computers. But they were only called mini because they were a lot smaller than mainframes that would have filled this whole room. But a mini computer was about as big as this podium. And they were very expensive, cost about $250,000 to buy it, and so complicated to use that the computer had to be sold direct to the customer, and the selling process involved lots of training, support, and service. And you just had to have those kind of costs in the company to play in that game. The average person didn't have the money or the skill to own a mini computer. And so I remember when I had my first job after grad school, I had to take a big stack of punched cards and take it to the corporate computing center where an expert ran the job for me. It was just so expensive and inconvenient, we didn't compute very often. But then the personal computer emerged, and the personal computer was a disruptive innovation relative to the mini and the mainframe computer. To describe the personal computer here, I'm going to actually make it a three-dimensional diagram, because the effect of the PC was to make it so affordable and so foolproof that even a poor fool like me could own a computer. At the beginning, on those early PCs, we could do just the simplest of things like typing and spreadsheets or simple games, and we still had to take the complicated problems back to the corporate computing center. But then little by little, out here in this third plane of competition, that PC just got better and better and better until ultimately you could do out here in this simple, convenient, affordable platform the computing problems that you used to have to take to the corporate computing center, and one by one, the applications were drawn from the back plane into the front, and all of the mainframe and mini-computer companies were blown out of the water, replaced by a new set of companies out here. And so why is it that digital missed the personal computer and got killed by it instead? Well, I mentioned that these were very complicated, expensive computers that cost about $250,000. And given the kind of cost that you had to incur to make those machines, digital had to generate about 45% gross profit margins on $250,000 just to cover their overhead costs. And that's how they made money. Well, in their environment of the 1980s, as in every company's environment every year, people were coming to senior management at that time with ideas to make new products. Some entailed making better computers than digital had ever made before. In fact, these would be so good that they could reach up into the tiers of the market where in the past people had had to buy even more expensive mainframes. When you looked at those business plans, they promised gross margins of 60%. And you could earn 60% on a very high price. Now, at the same time management was trying to decide if they should invest in those innovations, other people were coming in, parting the curtains in the management's offices, saying, "You guys, you don't get it. Look outside. The future is with the personal computer. Can't you see it?" Well, they could actually see the personal computers out there, but then they saw two other things. The first one is, do you remember how crummy those early PCs were? In fact, Apple sold its Apple II as a toy to children. Not a single one of Digital's customers could even use a personal computer for the first 10 years they were in the marketplace. And that meant that the more carefully they listened to their best customers and tried to reflect the customers' needs in their next products, they got no signal from their customers in the back plane that the PC mattered, because in fact it did not to them. But it could then get better and better and draw the applications one by one out. And then what made matters worse is when the management saw the business plans, in the very best of years, those business plans promised gross profits of 40%, and they were headed to 20% quickly. And you could only earn those paltry percentages on computers that sold for $2,000. And so really the choice the management had to make was, should we invest to make better products that we could sell for better profits to our best customers, or should we invest to make worse products that none of our customers would buy that would ruin our profit margins? What should we do? And it's a real dilemma. In fact, the first of the books that I wrote on this is called The Innovator's Dilemma, because these principles of good management that we teach at our school, and that is you should always listen to your customer and always focus investments where the profit margins are most attractive. They actually provide very good guidance to companies moving along that sustaining trajectory, but then they paralyze a well-managed company when one of these disruptive innovations emerges, because it simply doesn't make sense. And so that's the first piece of the model. And I hope that you're able now to look ahead in our applying this to the education industry, because what it says is that computer-based learning, because it generally has a different dimension of performance that it tries to optimize on, is a disruptive innovation relative to the conventional learning paradigm. And therefore, we would not expect the current leaders in the industry to lead this new initiative. Now, if you look across the sweep of business history at companies like in the middle, the Today column there, companies whose stock you wish you had owned over the last 20 years, almost every one of those companies whose stock prices outperformed the market were disruptive. For example, those of you with a bit of gray hair, do you remember where Toyota came into the market? Not with Lexuses, but they came in the 1960s with a crummy, rusty little subcompact called a Corona. And they made it so cheap that even some of you guys could have a car. And because the alternative for those customers was no car at all, they were really very delighted with the limited product. And then Toyota goes from a Corona to the Tercel, to the Corolla, to the Camry, to the Avalon, the 4Runner, and then to a Lexus. And every once in a while, General Motors and Ford, up there making big cars on the sustaining trajectory, would look out and down at Toyota and say, you know, we ought to go compete against those buggers. And so they'd send down a Chevette or a Pinto. But then they would compare the profitability of the little subcompact with the profitability of a Ford Explorer or a Cadillac Escalade, and it made no sense. And now Toyota's at the high end of the market, and it makes a lot of sense, but the game is largely over on Detroit. Who's killing Toyota? Toyota doesn't feel as if they're being killed, incidentally. Sir? Yeah, Kia and Hyundai, the Koreans, have stolen the low end of the market from Toyota, not because they're no good, but because they're very good. But it just makes no sense for Toyota to defend the low end when they have the privilege of taking Mercedes on at the high end, which is a much more profitable fight. And then you have Chery coming from China that nobody needs to worry about ever, really. And I just listed there a set of companies that are in the process of beginning to disrupt today's leaders, which became the leaders because they disrupted the prior generation as well. Now, one of the instincts that the leaders have when they see a technology that is potentially disruptive is to try to cram it into their existing market rather than create a new market first and then pull the applications from the old one. And it always causes them to spend billions of dollars and ultimately always to fail. And let me just illustrate how and why that works with the history of another disruption, which was the disruption of the vacuum tube by the transistor. And those of you with gray hair will know what I'm talking about. But those of you who don't have gray hair yet, up through the mid to late 1960s, the technology used in consumer electronics to make televisions and radios work were called vacuum tubes. And they were really as big as your fist. And a TV would have maybe 20 vacuum tubes in it. The transistor, which was developed first invented in the late 1940s, in the beginning 15 years of its life, it could not handle the power that was required to make a big radio or a big television. And so it was disruptive. Every one of the vacuum tube companies that existed in the 50s and 60s, and these were the giants of the electronics industry. RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, was the primary one, but General Electric, Westinghouse, Philco, Zenith, every one of them took a license to the transistor, but they carried their license into their own laboratories and framed it as a technology problem. In other words, the transistor cannot yet be used to make the big floor-standing TVs. The TVs were about this big, or big tabletop radios. And so they invested as a group, in today's dollars, over $2 billion trying to make the transistor good enough that it could be used in the market. Now, while they were working on that problem, out here in this third disruptive plane of competition, the first application for a transistor was a little hearing aid, which was actually a product that wasn't possible in the vacuum tube world. And here, the virtue was it couldn't handle much power, whereas in the backplane it was a vice. Then in 1955, Sony introduced its first transistor pocket radio. And again, I appeal to gray hair, but do you remember how crummy those Sony radios were? But they cost $2, fit in your pocket. I lived in Salt Lake City, where I grew up, and to get reception, I had to face west to the radio tower. But Sony chose to sell its transistor radio to the low end of humanity, people that were called teenagers at the time. And we as teenagers were just delighted to have a crummy product because it was infinitely better than the other alternative, which is no radio at all. Had Sony tried to sell its crummy little radio to the parents who had these nice big RCA machines, it would have been judged as crummy because it truly was. And so an interesting new market began to emerge there. And then in 1959, Sony introduced the first portable transistor television. Again, a very limited product. But Sony made it so affordable and simple that a whole new population of people who in the past hadn't had big enough bank accounts to buy an RCA TV or a big enough apartment to house one, now they could have one. And again, because it was infinitely better than nothing, they were thrilled. And a booming new market emerged here in what came to be called solid-state electronics. And as it was emerging, the leaders in the back felt no pain because these were all new customers. Then by the mid-1960s, the technology had gotten good enough that you could start to build big machines with it. And within 3 years, the customers just got sucked out of the vacuum tube plane into the solid-state plane, and every one of the vacuum tube companies vaporized. And it's really a sad story, isn't it? Because it's not that the management of the vacuum tube companies lacked vision. They saw the technology coming long before Sony did. It's not that they lacked commitment. They easily spent 20 times more money trying to make the technology work than Sony ever spent making the technology work. But what's punishing is that by cramming the disruptive technology into their existing products and markets, the only way that the people in that world would have adopted transistors instead of vacuum tubes is if solid-state electronics were more cost-effective and more performance-effective in those applications. And in other words, they pitted the disruption head-on in an attack against the sustaining technologies. And in the 1950s and 60s, that was a very onerous technical hurdle for RCA to overcome, because it had to be better in order to be adopted. Whereas Sony, by competing against non-consumption, all they had to do was make a product that was better than nothing, and the customers were just delighted. Now, so that's for perfectly rational reasons, the leaders in the industry went after the blue space because that was the big market. When Sony went after the green space, the size of the market was zero. And that's a core reason why the leaders have a difficult time pursuing disruptions, is good managers of big companies have a very hard time going after tiny markets. And it gives a big advantage then to the startups. Now, one other lesson that we've learned, and this is not just, this is something that happens in every of the hundreds of markets that we've studied. When the disruption occurs, it's not just the company who's making the product that displaces the company in the back plane, but the whole system gets disrupted. So in the back plane, vacuum tube TVs were sold by appliance stores, and the appliance stores made their profits by repairing the burned out vacuum tubes in the TVs that they had sold in the homes of their customers. And every year it was just a headache, because on average 2 vacuum tubes burned out. And you couldn't repair it yourself. You had to call the repairman. And so that's how the appliance stores made their money. When Sony developed its transistor products, it tried to get distribution through the appliance stores. But the appliance stores wouldn't give them the time of day because Sony's products didn't have any vacuum tubes in them to burn out. But lucky for Sony, Kmart was emerging just at that time. And Kmart couldn't sell vacuum tube products because they couldn't service them in the aftermarket. And so it was a marriage made in heaven, a product that needed no maintenance, with a retailer that could provide no maintenance. And so when the disruption occurred, it wasn't just Sony that killed RCA, but it was the whole channel that disrupted the whole channel. Whenever a company that is a would-be disruptor tries to hot swap its disruptive product into the old channels of distribution, it'll never work, because the economics of the product and the channel of distribution are all consistent there in the back plane. And so a completely new system of suppliers, makers of the products, distribution channels has to emerge. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, too. One of the reasons why the leaders in the industry, I said one reason why the leaders in the industry crammed the disruption into the back plane is the market size of the new one seems to be small and unattractive. Another one is it just seems to be a waste to create a new business model, because the existing business model is already there, and you just think it's so much cheaper to leverage what we have. And we'll talk about business models as they relate to education a little bit later, but it's comprised of four things. So the first element of a business model is a value proposition, which is a product that helps customers do more effectively, affordably, and conveniently a job that they've been trying to get done. Then a company with that target will have to put in place a set of resources, and the resources are people, technology, products, cash, that they can combine to deliver the value proposition. And as they use those resources to deliver the proposition, processes coalesce. And processes are just ways of working together to get things done that emerge over time as you use the resources to deliver the value proposition. As a company uses those processes to combine the resources to create the value proposition, ultimately then a formula for how to make money emerges. And that profit formula entails how big does the company have to become in order to be profitable, and what kind of assets need to be in place, and fixed costs, and then what kind of gross margins do we have to generate in order to cover those fixed costs. And once the profit formula is in place, it determines the value proposition that company can and cannot deliver. And that's a key reason I think you can see why the leaders in the industry do so well on the sustaining curve, because it fits the resources, processes, and profit formula, and so things just sail through. But when you try to introduce an innovation that doesn't fit the business model of the company, it just can't get approved, or as in the case of cramming it into the blue space, they'll twist a disruption and force it to compete as a sustaining innovation. Now, there are three generic types of business models. The first one we call a solution shop. And a solution shop is where you diagnose and solve problems. So a big high-end consulting firm is a solution shop. You pay them a lot of money. They'll diagnose the problem with your company and then recommend solutions. High-end law firms, ad agencies, R&D organizations, or at Mass General Hospital, the diagnostic activities of the specialist physicians is a solution shop within the hospital. In education, special needs education would be something like a solution shop, where the expertise of experts is required to create one-off solutions to every student's problem. The second kind of business model we call a value chain. And a value chain transforms inputs into higher value outputs. So the making of a car is a value chain business, as is computer manufacturing. Retailing is a value chain business. You bring goods in, you display them, you sell them for a higher price. Restaurants, you bring in ingredients, you cook something that tastes better, and you sell it for a higher price. And medical procedures after a definitive diagnosis are also a value chain business. You bring in a patient, you do this, ship her out the other end. The textbook business is a value chain business. You bring in raw information, you format it, you print it, you distribute it. And much of classroom instruction is structured like a value chain business. You bring students in, you ostensibly add value to them, you ship them to the next grade. Ultimately, in the end of high school, you ship them into society. Then the third class of business models we call user networks that link people so that they can help each other. So in a user network, the users of the network buy and sell or send and receive to each other. So telecoms is one of those things. Insurance and banking is one of those things. In healthcare, increasingly to care for chronic diseases, user networks like Crohn's.org are emerging, where the patients can teach each other how to care for their disease. And as you'll see, we think that the distribution system for computer-based learning is going to evolve from what is there exist today value chains by which textbooks are created and distributed, and instead user networks will be the mechanism by which those are distributed. And we'll get into that. There's a company called Agilix that has a really interesting network called Brain Honey that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now there's just one last concept from our research that we thought is applicable to the future of education, and it relates to how you compete and what the architecture of products is. So if you go back into the history of almost every industry, when the products aren't good enough for what people need, the way you compete is by making the best possible products. In order to make the best possible products, the architecture of those products has to be interdependent and proprietary in its character. And I'll just give you one example. Going back to computing, in the days of the IBM mainframe, you could not have existed as an independent supplier of operating systems because the design of the operating system depended upon the design of the logic circuitry. But you couldn't exist as an independent designer of logic circuitry because that depended upon the design of the storage system, which depended upon the design of the application software, which depended upon the design of the operating system. In other words, everything depended upon everything else, and you had to do everything in order to do anything, which meant you had to be a big integrated company to play in that game. If they had tried to create a different kind of architecture that we call modular, that is to say, you guys do the operating system, you do the logic circuitry, you do the disk drives, in order to specify how each of those things should fit together, it would have taken so many degrees of freedom away from the engineers that they would have had to back off the frontier of what was possible. And in that era, when the product doesn't perform well enough, you can't back off, but you have to optimize. And so the architecture, as we've depicted there with that little blue structure, is interdependent. But when and examples would be the mainframe. Microsoft Windows is an interdependent architecture. When the disruption occurs, you have to compete differently. So down here, the ability to customize what you make to the needs of individual customers and to be fast in bringing your solution to those customers is the way you compete. To compete that way, to be fast and flexible and responsive, the architecture has to become open and modular, like a Dell computer. And in a modular architecture, you can just mix and match and plug and play best-of-breed components to give every customer exactly what they want. Linux, as an alternative operating system to Windows, is a modular architecture. And the key thing as it relates to education is that it is very expensive to customize a proprietary interdependent architecture. For example, if you wanted your own version of Windows, you'd go up to Redmond and knock on the door and say, would you please let me in, because all I want to do is just change 10 lines of code. Believe me, that's all I want to do. They would never let you in, because if you change 10 lines of code, you got to change 10 million lines of code. Everything depends upon everything. And if you wanted really your own custom version of Windows, it would cost you somewhere upwards of $800 million. But the modularity of Linux, where it's just comprised of these kernels that snap together in a sense according to predefined standards. If you want to create your own operating system, you just go in and you don't even have to ask permission. You just say, I'll take that kernel and I'll stick it here and this one there. And the modularity facilitates customization. And in almost every industry, it transitions from an interdependent to a modular architecture as disruption occurs. So insights now that come from examining education through these lenses, the first one is there really are conflicting mandates in the way we have to teach versus the way we learn. The second is that computers have failed to make a difference because, just like RCA, we've crammed them into conventional classrooms instead of deploying them at the beginning to compete against non-consumption. Number three, a lot of computer-based learning products, the innovators have tried to distribute them through the conventional model of distribution in which states or school districts make a big one-size-fits-all adoption decision, as opposed to fostering the emergence of a user network. Second, separation is critical. Now, in the history of disruption in other industries, the only time the leaders in the industry caught the wave of disruption and survived as the leaders is when they set up a completely independent business unit underneath the corporate umbrella and gave it an unfettered charter to kill the parent. So IBM, for example, is the only manufacturer of mainframe computers or mini computers that survived into the PC generation. And they did it by setting up a completely independent business unit in Florida and giving it the complete freedom to create a very different profit formula where they could make money on 25% margins, whereas mainframes and minis needed between 45 and 60% margins. And because they created that different economic model, IBM made that transition. Ultimately, then Dell disrupted IBM out of the PC business. And so separation of some sort in our public schools is critical. Number 5, which we probably won't have time to get to today, is that although we vilify our schools as not being very responsive, actually they have been very responsive. But we've imposed, through policy changes and cultural changes on our schools, 3 disruptions in their recent history, and we've forced the public schools to execute on those disruptions within themselves rather than by setting up a separate business unit like IBM was allowed to do. And then number 6 is also we won't get to today. So one of the key insights, and this leads to applying the modularity interdependence problem, has come from a range of researchers, but one of what they agree on is that we all learn differently. So there's a professor at the Harvard Ed School named Howard Gardner that many of you know, and he's quite a controversial character because his research is a bit controversial and his personality is a bit controversial as well. And so some people don't quite agree with his characterization, but his essential message, as I read it, is that, you never ought to call somebody smart or dumb, because most of us are really smart in 1 or 2 types of intelligence, and we're completely clueless in a couple of other types of intelligence. And because we have those multiple intelligences, we learn differently. When I read his stuff, I just realized, my gosh, my whole life fell into place. So I'm 6'8". I tried to be a good basketball player, and I kind of made it into college, but never was good enough to have retired on an NBA salary. And when I read his work, I realized, Michael Jordan is just a genius in bodily kinesthetic intelligence, and his ability to control his body in such an exquisite way is actually resident in the way his brain is wired. And then I realized that in high school physics, when Mr. Steed would write one of those equations on the board, my best friend Rob Graves could see the equation and just visualize how the whole universe worked. And I'd look at the very same equation and start to pray that I could memorize it long enough to pass the exam, you know. And now I realize Rob wasn't smarter than me. It's just he had logical mathematical intelligence is right up at the front of his brain. And I was somewhere down in a naturalist world where I'm really pretty good at seeing patterns in things. But I just couldn't learn in the way that Rob's brain was wired to learn. And the problem is that Mr. Steed's brain was wired like Rob's brain. And those two would just sing to each other all period long. And occasionally Mr. Steed would look at me with the puzzle, as he just couldn't figure why I couldn't get it, because he had explained it so clearly, you know. And then, in addition to multiple intelligences, we have learning styles. And so if somebody buys one of my books and reads it, it's full of diagrams. In fact, my presentation has had lots of diagrams, because that's how I learn. And some people will read them and say, we just love the way you write your books because you can visualize how this is going on. And other people will read it and they'll say, Clay, don't put so many diagrams in your dumb books. You know, just write it down. But that's because they have different learning styles, and then we can learn at various paces. So there are conflicting mandates. And what we mean by that is that in our teaching infrastructure, that infrastructure is heavily interdependent. There's temporal interdependence. That is, I can't study this in 9th grade if I haven't studied this in 8th grade. And if I change what we do in 9th grade, it means we've got to change what we do in the other earlier grades. There's lateral interdependence. So we could actually teach foreign languages in a much more effective way, but it would require that we change the way we teach English grammar. There's physical interdependencies. I can't have team-based learning because the dumb school wasn't built to facilitate team-based learning. And then hierarchical interdependencies. I can't do this in my classroom because what I do is dictated at the district headquarters. And all of those interdependencies mandate standardization, because the economics of interdependence mandates standardization. And you can see that our public schools, in fact, are going pell-mell in this direction and standardizing in the way we teach and the way we test. And coming from that direction, it makes perfectly rational sense. But that butts up against the need for customization for differences in how we learn, which screams for modularity. And that's the big problem. Most of the people in our classrooms aren't learning when they're being taught because of that conflict between the mandate to standardize and the mandate to customize. And this is one reason why we think computer-based learning has such an important future in the reform and the improvement of our schools, because computers are inherently modularizable, in that you could, on the same computer, create software that would help one student learn in the way her brain is wired to learn and help Clay learn in the way his brain is wired to learn. Whereas the standard teaching model just struggles to customize because it wasn't designed to do that. Now, historically, most schools have crammed computer-based learning into the blue space. And Larry Cuban and others have studied the impact that our billions of dollars of investment in computers have made on the schools, and basically they've had no impact at all. Computers are put into the classroom, and never has the teacher said, kids, this is such a great day because we finally have a computer in our classroom. And what this means is the old learning model that was teacher-centric is obsolete. And so I'll see you sometime later. And It's never been deployed that way, but rather the computer is deployed to support and sustain the current business model, because in fact, it's been crammed into the classroom. And so they're used to teach typing. They're used to search the internet so that we can write better research papers. Much computer software, or learning software, has been built not because of its customizability, but the dominant intelligence in physics writes software that sings to Robert Graves, rather than taking this opportunity to write software that sings to other people, and we'll get into why that was the case. And instead, what we have to do is deploy computer-based learning in a disruptive way, which means competing initially against non-consumption. So where you see non-consumption is credit recovery, meaning not collecting on bad loans, but I failed my class. How do I make it up? It's very hard to do that within the conventional system. And so online learning has really taken root in that application. AP courses from apex.com homeschooled students, and in small rural and urban schools that can't afford or don't have the scope to offer AP or other courses, that's where you see online learning beginning to take off. And it has a transformative impact there, whereas it cannot have a transformative impact when the computer is just crammed into the classroom. Now, how would you do this if you were a member of the school committee of, say, a suburban school district? And let's just pick mine. I live in Belmont, which is just about 5 miles away from here. The vertical axis on the disruptive diagram is the social importance or the political importance of a subject. So the ones at the top, English language and literature, science, and math, are things on which standardized exams are administered. And if we're going to succeed at anything, we better succeed in those 4 courses. And then the low end are stuff that's just nice to have in the school, but because standardized exams aren't administered and school districts are not ranked on those bases, they're just nice to have and can be disposed of. Well, what's happened in our school district as the school committee struggles to balance the budget every year is amongst these nice-to-have courses, they just rank order the number of students taking the course, and whichever course has the lowest enrollment, they just lop the head off of that teacher as a way to earn money or save money. And so our poor German teacher lost her head. About 4 years ago, we have 5 kids. And the first 3, because we have German ancestry, took German and loved this woman. But she had to go, and so the message to the Christensens was, tough beans. We still got Spanish, and we hope the next 2 kids enjoy that. And then the next year, statistics goes, and then psychology, and then economics goes, as you try to shepherd the meager remaining resources on the things that matter the most. And in some school districts, like Oakland, California, pretty much everything's gone except the core courses because of that need to focus. Well, if instead the school committees would think disruptively, they would see this as a tremendous opportunity, because every time we have to narrow our offerings to save money, it creates non-consumption, which then constitutes an ideal market for computer-based learning. And so rather than tell the Christensens it's Spanish or nothing, you say, well, if you really do want to take German, go ahead and register, but that particular period, just go to the library and log on to apex.com/German, and you can take it online. And we understand that taking it online isn't as nice as having it directly from that wonderful teacher you had. But it's better than nothing. And in fact, we've got 4 different ways to learn German that can be customizable to the ways that your children might be wired to learn. And then go to the library and take statistics because we can't afford to teach it anymore. And because it's competing against non-consumption rather than competing against a teacher, it faces a much different reception in the marketplace. Now, I just wanted to give some projections for how computer-based learning is right now on a trajectory to supplant conventional learning. Whenever something that is new substitutes for something that is old, and this is true for all of the disruptions that we have studied, the pattern always follows an S-curve. So if you plot on the vertical axis the percentage of the market that the new has over time, it takes a while to take off, and then the world flips. And one of the problems that always happens to the leaders is they're down here, and they're looking at the vertical axis and saying, you know, this new stuff that everybody's saying is the future, it's really not very significant at all. And then they project out in a linear way, and then the world flips on them and they get killed. So, for example, in digital photography, which disrupted conventional film, it was down on the flat piece for about 10 years. And then just about 3 years ago, the world flipped on the film companies. Polaroid got killed, Agfa got killed, Fuji is just barely hanging on. And fortunately, Kodak read our stuff. And so they've caught it. But the world has flipped very fast, and then it asymptotically picks off the most resistant users of the old. Well, it begs the question, when you're down here, if you know the world is going to flip, how can I tell whether it's going to flip next year or 10 years from now? And there actually is a way to tell. So mathematically, if you just change it a little bit, and on the vertical axis, plot the ratio, the percent that the new has divided by what the old has. So if that ratio is 1.0, that means the new has half and the old has half. But then plot that data on a logarithmic scale over time. When you do that, the data always fall on a straight line. Now, sometimes the straight line is steep, and sometimes the straight line is shallow, but it's always straight. And the reason is that the mathematics linearizes the S-curve. And what the nice thing about doing it this way is that even when the new accounts for as little as 1% of the total, you can get a pretty good sense of what the slope of that line is going to be, and then project out so that you can approximate when is it going to hit 25% and 50% and 90% of the market. And so we've been struggling to collect this data, but it looks like if we plot the percent online versus overall enrollments on a seat miles per class basis and plot it that way on a logarithmic scale, we just are hitting about 1% of the market right now. But it really is falling on that straight line, and when you just project that out, it looks like it hits about 10 or 11% in 2014, and half of it by 2019. So that's the trajectory we're on. Now, that slope exists because I think it's more shallow than it could be because we haven't done a lot of things right. So we've wasted a lot competing against consumption. We haven't used this opportunity to teach people to learn in the way that their brains are wired to learn, and so on. Now, let me talk a bit about the business model. You remember that we described that there were value chains and user networks as two different kinds of businesses. Well, the first step in the value chain of creating instructional materials is the development of a textbook. And so you get some expert there, and they go through the process of putting those textbooks together. And the textbook industry is a very scale-intensive business. And scale-intensive businesses are ones where they're very high fixed cost, so that if you sell a few, your cost per product is very high, but if you sell millions, your cost per product is very low because you amortize those fixed costs. And the textbook world is very much that way. If you sell 1,000 of your copies of a textbook, it was horrifically expensive, but if you sell 1 million, it was very profitable. In steep scale businesses, the industries tend to concentrate over time, favoring the people who have the highest volume. And you see that happening in the textbook businesses. The big ones keep swallowing up the little ones because the little ones are way back here at a high cost position on the scale curve, and they just can't survive. Then the next step in the value chain is you need to get the adoption decision has to be made. And in some places, like often in Texas, adoption decisions are made at a statewide level. But in almost everywhere, the other adoption decisions are made at a district level. And that, similarly, is a very steep scale business because you got to have the scope to be able to make a sales call on every school district in the country in order to get the volumes of textbooks that are needed. And it's a value chain all the way through in that you bring things in, add value to it, and then deliver them to the next stage. And then teaching is a value chain business, as we mentioned. It has no scale. In other words, the bigger you get, the costs don't drop. And in fact, over the last X number of years, as we've tried to get as close to customization as we can by having smaller class sizes, we kind of move back along the cost curve to make teachers even more expensive per student. And that's the way the historical system has worked, and it's just a forbidding system. You can't really develop software, and given the economics of pricing software, carry it through this textbook adoption process. No software market is big enough to have a textbook manufacturer be very interested in it, or to be able, and you can't build a big enough market to justify the sales force to make the call on all of those people. So even though you can develop the software, the industry has struggled to emerge because of that. What we think will happen is that the user network will emerge to take the place of the old value chain. And remember, in a user network, the people who participate in the network buy and sell to each other, or they send and receive to each other. Now, in a disruption, most of the disruptions that I've described for you in other industries have occurred within, say, a value chain model. Somebody just figures out how to do it cheaper and more conveniently, but it's still a value chain kind of business. What causes an industry to completely change the generic type of business model is, I'll give you an analogy. So we were talking about the PC and how it disrupted computers. The PC made it so affordable and simple that even I as an individual could own a computer and use it. What shifts it from value chain to value network is if somebody made it so foolproof and idiot simple that I could even design my own computer, not just use it. And technology that makes it simple enough that individual people can build their own is what then creates the opportunity for a user network to emerge. Try to think through a couple of analogies for you. In the original business that gets disrupted in all of these industries that we've studied, because the products are expensive and complicated, they have to be pushed to the customer by the sales force of the product makers. And so digital equipment had to sell its products directly to the customer because they were so complicated. It's a complex selling process. When the disruption occurred, you marketed direct to the customer, who then pulled the computer through the distribution channel, because you couldn't sell these low-priced products direct to the customer. You see this happening if you just watch TV now. how many drugs are being marketed direct to the patient. And the reason why you do that is that the old process of pushing the drug through the doctor in the hospital is just too uneconomical now. And when you market direct to the patient, to the patient, it helps them diagnose their own diseases. So, for example, for me, for about the last 15 years, when I'd go to bed, I just had this horrific energy in my legs. And my brain would be dead tired, but my legs felt like I got to get up and play a basketball game. And I couldn't hold still. And it just drove our marriage just right to the abyss almost. And then one day Christine was watching TV, and she saw this advertisement for this drug called Mirapex, for this disease called restless leg syndrome. And she called Clayton. She called me at work, and she said, "Clayton, you got a disease. It's not that you're obnoxious, you got a disease." And sure enough, I got online and said, that's exactly the symptoms that I've gotten. So then I tell my doctor, I need Mirapex. And before that, I'd had a lot of exams with the doctor, but I didn't even know that I had to raise this as a problem because I didn't think it was a physiological problem, And that's because the patients, especially with chronic illnesses, are so much in better touch with how they're feeling. Marketing to the end user is much more effective to diagnose, and then they just pull it through the channel in that way, in the same way that PCs got pulled through the channel. And so rather than marketing software-based learning products through the old channel, which entails lots of push and scale, what happens here is if in a user network, the operator of the network makes it possible to surface products that were made to teach physics to Michael Jordan's brain or to my brain, then parents whose children are struggling to, my child, she is such a genius in math. Why in the world can't she pass a spelling test? But then you get online and you figure out, somebody in Keokuk, Iowa developed this method to help students with mathematical logical brains spell. And because we market to the end user, it will help the students and their parents or friends or teachers diagnose why learning isn't happening. And that's why we think that over time, to really make this substitution go at a faster and more resolute pace, these kinds of networks have to emerge because the old system simply can't handle the economics of the new kinds of products. I'm kind of running. Is there one more idea, and then we can have you criticize us. So this last one relates to, can we really change the system? And there's a piece of research that we published in the Harvard Business Review a year ago called The Tools of Cooperation. And the question that this has been designed to help managers think through is, so suppose you are a visionary CEO, as all CEOs aspire to be, and you can see that a couple years down the future, even though nobody else can see over the horizon, you can see over the horizon, and the future's going to turn left, not straight ahead. And you got to now convince the people in your organization that they need to already start to prepare because the future is going to be different. So how do I get the people to cooperate with me when I know that the company has to fundamentally change? And these mechanisms that an executive can employ when she needs to get her employees to march to a different drummer in a different direction, we call the tools of cooperation. And it turns out that most of the tools of cooperation don't work most of the time. And sometimes it's a null set, as you'll see is the case in schools. But what determines what tools will work is on these two axes. I'll plot on the vertical axis the extent to which there's consensus in what we all want out of our participation in the enterprise. And so you can go from an extreme of no consensus, where everybody wants something different, to the other extreme where everybody's in it for the same thing. And then on the horizontal axis is the extent to which there's pre-existing consensus on what actions will yield what results. So you can go again from no consensus, nobody agrees that if you do this, what's going to be the outcome, to the other one, everybody agrees that if you do this, this will be the result. So the kinds of tools that work really then vary. So down in the lower left quadrant, the only thing that works are power tools. And this is not Black & Decker, but these are things like decapitation, coercion, fiat, threats, control systems, role definition. A good example of the wielding of power tools is in the Balkans. You got a bunch of ethnic groups there that have just hated each other's guts for thousands of years. And they're way down at the bottom because they all wish the other ethnic groups would get out and leave them alone. They have very different views on the way the world works. And so they'd fought for centuries. And then Marshal Tito comes in. And he herds these folks into this artificial nation called Yugoslavia at the end of World War II. And he sticks a gun in their face and says, you know what? I really don't care if you agree with me on what you want out of life or how to get it. I just want you to look down the barrel of this gun and think about whether you want to cooperate with how I want to run this country or not. And in retrospect, they should give the guy the Nobel Peace Prize, because he brought peace to a location where just the very term balkanized has become a verb or an adjective in the English language. Then there's another class of tools that we call management tools, where different participants may want different things, but they all agree on cause and effect. And management tools include training, standard operating procedures, measurement systems. So if we don't agree on what causes what, I can train you out the gazoo, and you won't do it because you see no value. In the similar way, we can put into place standard operating procedures, but if we don't agree that doing it this way gets the result we'll need, people won't follow. In this quadrant, they're leadership tools, where people have a sense of where they want to go, but they don't really know how to get there. And sales forces very often are up there. They all want to get rich, but how to sell is not very clear. And the kinds of tools that work there are vision statements, and the charisma and salesman ability of a leader and role modeling energize people to go in that direction, even though you don't specify how to get there. And one of the reasons why there's such a huge secondary market in used vision statements is that if everybody doesn't agree on what they want, you can be as eloquent as you want to be in the vision statement, and people will dismiss it as motherhood if they're at the bottom of the matrix. There's a class of tools that are kind of in the middle. These include strategic planning, negotiation, financial incentives, that will only work when there's a modicum of agreement on both dimensions. And so, this is too controversial to get into here, but if you want to know why peace negotiations in the Middle East never work, it's because the folks on both sides of the table are way down in the decapitation end of the quadrant, and there just isn't sufficient agreement to be able to even conduct a meaningful negotiation. Financial incentives, we keep thinking that maybe they'll work to get teachers to behave in the way we want them to behave. But just over and over again, financial incentives fail because the situation is not where that tool will work. And then in the upper right are culture tools. And tools of culture include democracy, rituals, religion, folklore. And the problem with the tools up there is they're not very good at managing change, but what they do is they reinforce the status quo. And it's interesting, as we thought about this, that democracy, what this says, is as a tool of cooperation, actually only works in rarefied situations. That is where people want the same thing out of their participation, and where there's a pretty clear agreement on cause and effect. And where America has tried to impose democracy in countries that don't have high levels of agreement on both of those two things, what you tend to get is a complete breakdown in social order. For example, in Haiti, where they just don't have that kind of sense. That's what's happened. And in Africa, that tends to happen over and over again, and we're seeing a similar thing happen today. So, where do you think the schools are on this matrix? Probably somewhere down in the lower left, aren't they? Politicians are driven by some things, parents by others, students are driven by other things, the teachers' unions by other things. And the problem is that even though we're down here, we're a democracy, or we can negotiate. And what that means is that many of the tools of cooperation that executives think are at their disposal really are not. And in our study of innovation, when we've been in this situation where we see the need to change, but there just isn't agreement on either of these axes, then there's one tool that you can pull out of your quiver, and we call it the tool of disaggregation. So I mentioned that IBM was able to survive the disruption because it set up a completely independent business unit underneath the corporate umbrella. And they made the transition very well. The department stores all got disrupted by the discount stores. Well, one of the department stores didn't get disrupted, and that was Dayton Hudson in Minneapolis. They set up a completely separate business unit under the corporate umbrella called Target. And as the department stores have been driven out by the discounters, Dayton Hudson has made the transition very well because it disaggregated, and rather than force the department store to agree on a new course of action, they did this. And so we see chartered schools as one way to disaggregate, or pilot schools in the city of Boston. But it just really is a hard thing for inside the mainstream of the schools to get the kinds of changes that need to be made. Now, there's just a general model, and this will be the last slide, and then I'll just invite you to send your criticisms up. If I plot on the level, the vertical axis, the level of change, a lot of changes in a physical product entail just improving the performance of each component. So I can design a new, better computer by making a faster microprocessor, putting in a Windows Vista operating system, more gigabytes in the disk drive, and so on. Or I can change a process by improving individual steps in the process. When that happens, the kind of organizational unit that can execute that effectively, we call a functional team. And that is, everybody just has to work on their piece of the problem. And because the way the components interface with each other is very standardized and uniform, they actually don't have to coordinate much with each other, because the coordination is handled by the specifications of the product. But at a higher level, I'm changing my component, and in order for me to do that, it's going to change the way the adjacent component has to be designed. And so there is a predictable interdependency there. Or if I'm changing a process, when I change this step in the process, it's going to affect how they interface with other steps in the process. When that happens, we have to create what we call a lightweight team. And a lightweight team has a project manager, but the members of the team that have a primary responsibility to their own department head. And so when they have a team meeting, the members sit around the table with the mindset that they are there representing the interest of their department. And when they reach a decision, they all say, okay, I'll go back and check with my boss to be sure that that's okay. But that kind of committee structure works when we have that type of change that we call lightweight. But there's another level of change where I just got to fundamentally re-architect this system. And that means there are going to be different components, or we're going to combine two components into one, or divide one component into two, or cause the components to interface with each other in a different way. Or in a process change, what are the steps in the process? We're going to combine them, separate them, reconfigure their sequence. When that happens, it requires what we call a heavyweight team. And when you create a heavyweight team, the members of the team sit around the table not representing the interest of their department, but they just bring their expertise. And they have a different charter, which is, I don't care what the components are here. All I want to do is for you to create an elegant new system. If you've got to get rid of components, if you've got to add cost here in order to save system costs there, if you've got to combine things, whatever you need to do, do it, but we want to, it's the product architecture that hits this goal that you have the freedom to rethink. A good example is the way Toyota has done things. Toyota has just been insanely detailed at writing the specifications for how every component in its car should be designed and how they fit together with all the other components. And because they've specified it at such detail, the people don't have to work together very much. Every component group designs and builds their own component, but because the specs are so clear, they just snap together at the end with very high levels of quality. So Toyota can go from the concept to the launch of a new car in about 20 months, whereas it takes Mercedes almost 6 years. But the Prius, the hybrid vehicle, is a fundamentally different architecture. So the braking system in a Prius generates electricity, and the electrical system has to operate at very different levels of voltages, which means that that whole battery and generator system has to be rethought. And then you have an electric motor inside interfacing with a gasoline engine. The electric motor doesn't need a transmission, but the gasoline engine does. This is a very different architectural problem. And so Toyota, even though it designs all the rest of its cars in functional teams, for the Prius, it picked up technologically astute people from each of the component departments, stuck them together in a very different part of Japan, and basically said, who knows how you're going to build a hybrid vehicle, but you got to figure it out. And the first generation was pretty good. The second generation, they kept that heavyweight team together, was really an elegant car. And just go online and look at the miles per gallon in a Toyota Prius versus the miles per gallon in the competing hybrid vehicles. And the Prius gets you almost 20 miles per gallon more because they did it in a heavyweight team, whereas, for example, Honda's hybrid vehicle was designed in a lightweight team, and it's a pretty clunky car. I hope none of you guys have one. And then the highest level of change is where you have a very disruptive business model, either so that the product or process is used in a disruptive business model, and that's what requires the kind of autonomous team that we talked about in Target and IBM. We think that chartered schools are probably best characterized as heavyweight teams, in that their purpose is not to disrupt, but rather give us the freedom to just rethink the architecture of the system. And some of those, like the KIPP schools, have a very different architecture. And generally, it's when you have that opportunity to have a different architecture that the flexibility to use computers in learning is the greatest. And one of the reasons why reform of our schools has been so difficult is most committees that are organized to change things are functional committees. And when you give a functional team the responsibility to rethink a product architecture, it's just like marching to hell. It's a very, very difficult problem to change anything fundamental. And generally what happens is that the result mirrors the organizational structure rather than being the kind of architecture that we're thinking about. So those are just what we've been thinking about, why our schools have struggled to improve and what to do about it. Do you have any cat calls or criticisms or questions? Oh, thanks.